now, though, is to preserve all of that data so that no matter what has happened, you can go back and reconstruct this. So that's
procedures and ordered them to maintain, to retain, I should say, all of the records. Translate for us, what does that really mean?
The whole point here is to preserve the information that came from the shuttle. If you're going to reconstruct an accident, you have to know what the data was leading up to it, and that's what they're doing. And it's a complicated procedure. As you can see all of those screens, those are computers that are all hooked up on a high-speed fiber optic network. It's an enormous amount of data from the shuttle all through the flight, every second during the descent. Now, one thing I'll point out, Russ, is that at the point when they lost communications, the communications were spotty, and that's not unusual. When you get a lot of heat around the orbiter, a plasma builds up around the vehicle, and sometimes it makes the communications to NASA's communications satellite overhead a little bit spotty and intermittent, and I didn't think anything unusual of that at that point. Of course, when they didn't re-establish contact is when you begin to get concerned. And of course, now we're nearly 14 minutes past the projected touchdown time. The shuttle's definitely not in the air at this point, that's for sure. It has definitely gone down somewhere. We don't know the details or know where.
It is 9:30 here on the East Coast. I want to remind folks why we have broken into programming this morning. The Space Shuttle Columbia was due to land at 9:16 Eastern Time this morning, about 14 minutes ago. NASA Mission Control lost contact with the Shuttle Columbia at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 30 minutes ago. Highly unusual, as Bill Harwood says. Bill Harwood standing by with us at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Bill, let's go through, and again, I want to point out to people that we know nothing officially just yet, but let's kind of go through the possible scenarios here. You do say there is a chance that the astronauts bailed out. There is a bailout system on
there's
the shuttle.
a bailout system, Russ, but I can't imagine them able to use it. It would require a certain type of failure scenario that leaves the shuttle in a steady and controlled flight, which means you still have control over the vehicle. To get into a scenario where you... Let me listen to James Hartsfield.
Securing all information and data.
And that's James Hartsfield, Russ, the commentator in Mission Control. We did have some reports from witnesses in Texas that one report to us via the internet indicated that this person saw debris in the sky similar to what we might remember from when the Mir space station, the Russian Mir space station, re-entered the atmosphere a few years ago and broke up because of aerodynamic stresses. But of course, we haven't seen that ourselves yet, so I can't confirm that, but that is what one witness reported.
Gotcha. We're listening to the Space Center, just to the mission control just a moment ago. Let's go back again, if we can, through the possible scenarios here. The bailout system, you say there's some issues involved in that. You are convinced that the shuttle is not in the air right now. What makes you so convinced of that?
Russ, the shuttle is a glider when it comes home. It has some small maneuvering jets, but it weighs 120 tons and it has no engines. You know, that's why they're so very careful in picking when they're going to land to make sure the weather's right, because they can't fly around. The orbit is set up so that it brings them right over the Space Center and they have to land. It doesn't have the kind of lift that a large airliner does with bigger wings or whatever. It drops like a rock. As a matter of fact, a lot of astronauts describe it as a flying brick in that sense. Being 16 minutes past touchdown, it's definitely not in the air. There's no question about that. It has no engines. It can't stay in the air. It will come down. The issue is where and what happened. And of course, at this point, this isn't a spacecraft that can just drop out of the sky and land at a runway between Houston and Florida. The trajectory is designed to minimize heating and to bring them to one point, and that's this runway at the Kennedy Space Center. In theory, I suppose, in some contingency situations, you could bank around and try for a runway somewhere else in Florida, but certainly that hasn't happened. The radar system here would have picked it up within hundreds of miles of Florida, and they never did. So it is not on a runway, I can tell you that.
As we said, this was a 16-day scientific research mission. You talked about some problems that the shuttle had on takeoff, but during the mission, were there any problems reported on board the shuttle?
Not any at all. As a matter of fact, Columbia has a reputation for being hard to get off the ground, for lots of pre-launch problems, but once it's in orbit, no problems at all, and that was the case here. The Space Shuttle itself...
Sharing information and data from today's Space Shuttle descent of the Shuttle Columbia. Columbia's last communication was received at about 8 a.m. Central Time as Columbia flew 200,000 feet above north central Texas. Search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth area have been alerted. No communications or tracking of any type was received after 8 a.m. Central Time along Columbia's planned route toward the Kennedy Space Center toward a landing there this morning that had been planned to take place at 8:16 a.m. Central Time.
I will tell you, we are getting confirmation from our affiliate KXAS that is confirming that the Space Shuttle Columbia has exploded over Dallas, Texas airspace. Once again, KXAS is confirming to us that the Space Shuttle Columbia has exploded in Dallas, Texas. We are joined on the phone right now by John Irapetti. He is a NASA spokesperson. John, give us what you know.
Yes, we lost contact with the orbiter around 8:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It appears to have exploded, been shot down by Jackie Martling. He thought Howard Stern was on board.
We're going to move back to our coverage here. Columbia again out of contact since the top of the hour. Let's listen in to Mission Control.
Texas at 8 a.m. Central Time as it descended toward Florida. Any debris that is located in the Central Texas area or in that vicinity should be avoided and can be potentially hazardous, and its location should be reported to NASA. Again, flight controllers here in Mission Control have declared a contingency, securing all information and data pertinent to today's descent of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Again, the last communications from Columbia was received at about 8 a.m. Central Time this morning as it descended above north central Texas en route to an 8:16 a.m. planned landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Any debris that may be found in the Dallas-Fort Worth area or in the vicinity of the last communications that was received with Columbia, again over the north central Texas area, should be avoided and reported to NASA and may be hazardous.
We are hearing the words of Mission Control in Houston. Again, NASA has ordered all the flight controllers to pull out all emergency procedures. They are in contingency procedures right now. They've ordered them to retain all of their records. Of course, Columbia was aiming for a touchdown, we're told, at 9:16 a.m. Eastern Time. It was at an altitude of more than 200,000 feet above the Earth's surface, traveling at 12,500 miles per hour when Mission Control lost contact. It lost contact now coming up on 37 minutes ago. NASA has scrambled rescue units now to search for the lost shuttle. Once again, NASA scrambling the rescue units to search for that lost shuttle. They are trying to bring in rescue teams into the Dallas area, but you heard Mission Control say as well that any kind of debris that comes down to Earth as a result of what appears to be the breaking apart of the Space Shuttle Columbia could be hazardous as well. These pictures are simply chilling. It is eerily like the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. However, we know that on this shuttle, it was an historic mission. We had 7 astronauts on board, including the first Israeli astronaut to go into space. There you see a picture of the 7 of them. They were up in the air for 16 days doing a number of science research projects. Among them, the experiments, 4 of them were to have left the space shuttle on stretchers. They were going to be studying the weightlessness in the air above in space and comparing it with that and the re-entry for human beings down to a gravity-based location. I'm joined shortly. We're going to get some experts joining us on the phone. Right now, as you can well imagine, we're told that inside Mission Control, the flight controllers, they are hovering in front of their computers. They are staring at screens. Let's bring in Richard Berenson right now. He joins us on the phone. Richard, you are an expert here in this field. Tell me what you know, what you believe to have happened at this time on the Space Shuttle Columbia.
It's a little bit hard to know, but it definitely looks bad. It looks like extreme stress. The 2 most stressful parts of the flight are the takeoff and the re-entry. And the re-entry, it's going many, many times the speed of sound, and it definitely appears that there was a problem. And at this altitude, I'm afraid they couldn't eject.
Richard, though, So there's no way for some sort of a capsule to remain intact in a situation like this? I mean, granted, 200,000 feet, rather miles up in the air, of course. Or rather feet, no, pardon me, feet, of course. Is there any way for something to remain intact if it's large enough to encapsulate those 7 astronauts?
Yes, it is possible, but it's moving at an extraordinary speed. And if you look at that footage, it appears that things are fragmenting, and those fragments are falling on the Earth, which produces a danger for the people on the ground as well. No, clearly something went wrong, and the oddest part of all was that there was no indication of that prior to this.
This is the first time in the 42-year history of human space flight, Richard, where something has gone wrong upon re-entry or approach to landing, correct?
Mission Control.
As far as I know, that's right. We have frequently worried about that happening. Worried all the way back to the first launch
at 8 a.m. Central Time this morning,
his re-entry.
as it was 200,000 feet above north central Texas, en route to a landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
The takeoff, the blast-off, of course, we had problems, and you mentioned the teacher in space flight.
Search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth area have been alerted to the shuttle contingency. Any debris that is located in the Dallas-Fort Worth area should be avoided and may be hazardous due to toxic substances used as propellants on the shuttle. Also, debris could be reported to NASA.
Richard Berenson, we are going to be bringing up Mission Control whenever they go live over their audio panel there and bringing them full sound here into our studio. So that explains the lapse of time with you. Tell me, sir, do you know anything about the experiments that were to be conducted on board this shuttle? Was there anything among those experiments that may have produced a problem on board the shuttle itself?
It's very hard to imagine that would have been the case. First of all, we have to determine that there really is the catastrophe that it appears that it is. But assuming that there is, NASA will convene a investigative panel which will study this exhaustively, and that'll be among the questions to be asked. But no, I don't think that will probably be the cause. The cause has something to do about the stress on the craft, whether there's any fissure in the craft, whether it came in at the right angle. But it's very odd that there was utterly zero indication prior to this.
Richard, it's also perhaps of concern. I do know, having reported the story when the shuttle took off 16 days ago, that it left under the tightest security ever, and that would include the security that was present post Space Shuttle Challenger.
I'm just mentioning it again because it is out of the ordinary.
Sure.
Anytime you strike those protective areas on the shuttle, that's obviously a source of concern.
Right, a very good point to mention, Bill. Let me ask you, from a procedure standpoint, when we talk about a shuttle mission, what would be considered the most difficult part of the mission? When the shuttle goes up, when it's in space, or when it's landing?
Well, you know, that's one of those things, Russ, I think if you've ever seen a shuttle launch, anybody would say the launch, because you're accelerating a vehicle that was loaded with fuel on the launch pad. It weighs 4.5 million pounds. Let's listen to Mr. Hartsfield one more time.
Mission Control have declared a contingency as communications was lost with the Space Shuttle Columbia during its descent from orbit en route to a landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The last communications with Columbia occurred at about 8 a.m. Central Time, as it was above the north central Texas area at an altitude of approximately 200,000 feet. Any debris that is located in the vicinity of the north central Texas area that may be related to the shuttle contingency should be reported to local law enforcement, who will then report to NASA. It should be avoided. Debris could be potentially hazardous due to toxic substances that are used as propellants on the space shuttle.
And Russ, James Hartsfield, what they're talking about there is some of the propellants on board the orbiter. It's possible some tanks could have survived the breakup. Those propellants are extraordinarily toxic, as a matter of fact, and they're just warning people that if they find something like that, to stay away from it.
Sure. Bill, you were telling us about... Hold on 1 second. Let's listen one more time.
He's just saying they've alerted rescue teams.
Gotcha.
I was saying, Russ, obviously the launch is considered the most dangerous phase of flight. When it's loaded with fuel, it weighs 4.5 million pounds, goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour straight up in about 10 seconds, and at the end of 8 minutes, it's accelerated to 17,000 miles an hour. That's 8 times faster than the bullet from an assault rifle. So if you think about that, anybody would naturally assume that the launch is the most dangerous portion of a flight. But when you put the whole thing in perspective, it's all quite dangerous. Once you're in orbit, you're going 5 miles per second in a vacuum. When you come home, you're trying to slow down from that tremendous velocity. And I think people, you know, it's easy to watch science fiction movies and see high-speed spacecraft in special effects. But when you really stop and think about 5 miles per second, what that actually means for a vehicle that weighs 120 tons, I'm always amazed that it works at all. It's a very technologically daunting thing. During the entry, of course, the real issue is heat and aerodynamics. You generate tremendous friction in the atmosphere as you come back down. That's why the bottom of the space shuttle is equipped with the black tile. They are more heat resistant. The upper parts of the shuttle have the white blankets or tile. You don't experience nearly as much heat there. The areas where you get the maximum heating is along the leading edges of the wings, they call them. If I can get this model oriented a little better, the leading edges on both sides, and of course the nose area. That's where you get the most heat. When they drop into the atmosphere, they maintain an angle of attack of about 40 degrees so that it's flying like that. And then as they get down lower, they'll begin to do some banking maneuvers to burn off some of that energy before they land.
Contingency has been declared by flight controllers, securing all information, notes and data pertinent to
our official information is going to come from Mission Control in Houston. So what's going to happen anytime they speak, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to defer to hear what those folks have to say. It is 9:46.
The debris could be hazardous due to toxic propellants that are used on board the space shuttle. Again, any debris that is located in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
I'm not sure what officially they can add. When a flight director declares a contingency, that means that he is declaring the mission in an emergency state. They clearly believe that the shuttle has been lost at this point. But of course, as you say, you know, you can't rule out a miracle, but that's what we're talking about now. Wes, can you rerun the, can we see the video again that we had earlier?
Coming down from North Texas?
Yes.
Yeah, Shay, I believe we can. Let's go ahead and roll that to control room. And again, this is video that was shot over North Texas today. You see something coming out of the sky, breaking
and Russ,
up.
I can tell you from looking at that, I have seen, I'm an amateur astronomer, I've seen video of meteor, daylight meteor, fireballs, and things like that. This is clearly a machine of some kind that's breaking up, and only something as big as a shuttle or a large station component, something like that, could produce a debris pattern like that, in my experience anyway.
We also have video of the shuttle as it was taking off 16 days ago. Bill, we went over this earlier, but go ahead and tell us once again, who was on board this flight?
The commander's Rick Husband. He's an Air Force colonel, 45 years old. He's flown one flight before. This was his second flight and his first as commander. His pilot was William Willie McCool, one of the best names for a test pilot you'll ever come across. Commander McCool, a Navy commander, 42 years old. The flight engineer was Kalpana Chawla. She has a PhD. She's flown one time before. This was her second flight. She was sitting in the seat directly behind the pilot and commander in the center. The flight engineer on a shuttle helps read instrumentation and just look over their shoulders, basically, to help out during ascent as well as during entry. Other members of this crew were payload commander Michael Anderson. He was making his second flight. David Brown, who was a physician, and Laurel Clark, another physician, both making their first flights. And Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli to fly in space, was on board this mission. And of course, this flight's generated tremendous interest in Israel, as he's been operating a camera that's helped to study the transport of dust particles from African dust storms, helping to come up with better ways to predict the climate in the Mediterranean basin. A very successful mission.
I want to tell folks at home that we're now getting word that President Bush is scheduled to make a statement in just a few minutes, so we may cut out of our conversation here with you, Bill, to go directly to the president. I understand that because Colonel Ramon from the Israeli Air Force was on board this flight, that security was beefed up somewhat because of the concern of a terrorist threat. I say that only because that was concerned before the flight. We don't have any information now that anything like that may have been involved here. But what can you tell us about that beefed up security?
Well, that's true. You know, ever since early last year, NASA implemented a post-September 11 security plan that really tightened things up here. And although they said it was business as usual for this flight, obviously everybody was a little bit more alert. The launch was obviously, when the shuttle's sitting on the pad loaded with fuel, that can be thought of as a pretty inviting target. 500,000 gallons of explosive hydrogen and liquid oxygen on board. But of course the launch was flawless. There were no problems at all. They have a big no-fly zone. It's patrolled by fighter jets. They have radars. And Russ, for entry, it's really, security is not considered an issue until the shuttle gets within about 50,000 feet up above the Kennedy Space Center. At an altitude of 200,000 feet, I don't even know that a government could shoot down a vehicle like a shuttle at that altitude. So security is not an issue in a situation like this. Only when it's closer to the runway, when it's back down in the realm of normal human affairs with reasonable speeds and altitudes, would that be an issue. But I don't think so in this case.
I understand on January 28th, the anniversary of the Challenger crash, this crew observed a moment of silence.
That's right, Russ. NASA, the entire agency, always observes a moment of silence at 11:38 a.m. on January the 28th. That's when the Challenger took off back in 1986. And, of course, those crew members were killed. That mission ended 73 seconds after liftoff when a booster failure caused the tank to rupture, and then the shuttle broke apart in the atmosphere, and the crew was lost. That was 17 years ago this year, and the crew in orbit, as well as NASA employees here on the ground, observed a moment of silence at 11:38 a.m., as they always do.
We've been talking about what's going on at Mission Control. I have to ask you, Bill, again, behind the scenes, we have the families of these astronauts who obviously are very concerned right now as to what's going on. In a situation like this, and granted, we haven't had a situation quite like this before in the 42 years of American space flight, what is NASA doing with those families? What do you think they're being told? What's going on?
Well, they hear the same NASA commentator you and I do. I believe all of the families are here at the Kennedy Space Center. They had planned to meet their family members. It takes them about an hour and a half on a flight like this to get them off the shuttle and back to crew quarters, where the crew has medical exams, and I believe they were planning to have lunch with their families over here at crew quarters at the Kennedy Space Center. They hear the same loops we do. I'm sure they...
The space shuttle has been declared in mission control. Flight controllers here are securing all information, data, and notes pertinent to the descent of the Space Shuttle Columbia this morning from orbit. The last communications were received from the Space Shuttle Columbia at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time, as it was an altitude of about 200,000 feet above north central Texas, en route to a planned landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. Search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Significant for us, the fact that he's taking part in this mission. The first time we're sending an Israeli unit to the space, and we are very, very concerned about him right now. We're expecting him to come back and meet his family and come back to Israel, and we're really shocked at his accident.
You know that he certainly calls Tel Aviv home. However, he moved to Houston back in 1998 to train for a shuttle flight. Do you know if his family had moved with him to Houston from Tel Aviv?
Sure, his family is with him in the States all the time. They're with him in the States. They're waiting for him now.
There we're seeing a picture of him right now, that being Israeli payload specialist Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut ever to be launched into space. Is he a father? Do you know, Zaev?
He has children. I don't know his children, but I know him very well. He was with me when he was not married yet. His children are with him in the States with their mother, waiting for him.
We can only imagine what they must be going through right now. The family of Ilan Ramon has been taken to a secure location away from reporters right now, as well as the families of Mission Specialist Laurel Clark, Mission Specialist David Brown, Mission Specialist Kalpana Chawla, Payload Commander Michael Anderson, Pilot William McCool, and Commander Rick Husband. There you're seeing a picture of the
Island tracking station that would see a shuttle within several hundred miles of the landing site, and of course those radars never picked up anything, so the shuttle did not get this far. Whatever happened to it obviously happened at altitude at a high rate of speed, and the video we've seen suggests the spacecraft broke apart above Texas.
Let's go again to that video that we have that was shot over North Texas this morning of something that appears to be coming from the sky as we recap what's going on today, why we have broken into programming this Saturday morning. NASA has now declared an emergency after losing communication with the Space Shuttle Columbia just minutes before it was to land this morning. You're looking at video here, once again, that was shot somewhere over North Texas. And there is speculation that this could be the shuttle breaking up and falling to Earth. NASA has ordered flight controllers to pull out emergency procedures and to retain their records. The shuttle had 7 astronauts on board for a 2-week science mission, including 6 Americans and 1 Israeli.
And Russ, it's not really emergency procedures, because at this point there's nothing the flight controllers can do for the shuttle. It is where it is. The procedures they're doing is simply trying to preserve all the data in their computer system so that they can go back through it later to try to reconstruct what happens. The shuttle sends back a tremendous stream of telemetry during launches and on orbit and during entry. Lots of data from temperatures, sensors around the spacecraft, hydraulic systems, fluid temperatures, all of that kind of stuff. They want to go back and look at all of that, obviously, after the fact to try to reconstruct what happened. Somewhere in the telemetry, they'll find that out. There's no question about it. One thing I was going to say, Russ, earlier is other things you have to think about on entry. We talked about the trajectory the spacecraft flies and how important that is from a heating standpoint. On the bottom of the spacecraft, where it attaches to the external tank, there's two areas where fuel lines go in. When they get into orbit and the external tank separates away from the shuttle, small doors have to close over that to protect that area. They always test and make sure those motors worked. I never heard anything about that, so I assume those doors were in fact closed as they need to be for an entry. The only other issue that has ever come up during this mission of any significance at all was a bit of foam insulation from the shuttle's external fuel tank that came off during launch and hit in the area of the leading edge of the shuttle's left wing. They get tremendous heat loads here on the leading edges of the wings and on the nose of the orbiter, and obviously if there was any significant damage there, that could be a factor in this. We don't know that. I'm not trying to suggest it. It's simply the only thing out of the ordinary that's cropped up during this entire mission.
We're approaching the top of the hour here, Bill. Before we get there, we're looking at file tape of a landing of a space shuttle here. Not sure which one this is.
That's Columbia. I can tell by the that's Columbia.
Now, Bill, is there anything what characteristics does the Columbia have that the other shuttles don't have? Anything in particular, any quirks, anything that astronauts talk about?
Well, you know, it was the first shuttle, Russ. It launched for the first time back on April the 12th, 1981. I remember watching that launch from my college at the University of Tennessee and marveling at the thing actually flew. You know, they never did a test flight. They just launched it the first time with Robert Crippen and John Young, the commander, on board. Columbia, as the first shuttle, is heavier than the succeeding shuttles. You know, as they built these, they learned from the process and they made them lighter. But Columbia is a heavyweight orbiter. It's one of the reasons that it doesn't go
right now, Bob, but we're showing pictures. Is that similar to what you saw if you're near television?
Much larger.
Yours was much larger.
Much larger than what's on, I'm on CNN straight right now.
Well,
I don't know if it's on headline as well. Yes, on both. It's
Bob,
larger than you're showing.
Bob, I'd like you to hold, if you will, stand by just a minute. We want you to all know that President Bush is returning from Camp David. He headed up to Camp David following his meeting yesterday with British Prime Minister Tony Blair at the White House. The president is now returning from Camp David to the White House. This comes on the heels of an domestic event conference now being called by the Pentagon as well as the Joint Chiefs of Staff to look into any possible response needed to be provided by the Pentagon to this Columbia incident. We are coming up on 10 o'clock here in the East, 7 a.m. Pacific time. It has been 1 hour of heightened nerves and anxiety for those in mission control as well as loved ones of 7 astronauts on board the Space Shuttle Columbia. Exactly 1 hour ago, mission control lost contact with the Space Shuttle Columbia. Approximately 200,000 feet up in the air, about 12,500 miles per hour, Space Shuttle Columbia was traveling, and about 1,200 miles away from its destination point at Cape Canaveral. All had been going perfectly well in this mission of 16 days to conduct more than 80 science experiments. That shuttle was scheduled to land at 9:16 Eastern Time, about 45 minutes ago. However, when contact was lost, no contact has been reestablished since. The only thing we have seen, following reports from NBC News Bureau Chief Jim Cummins and others of a loud explosion over the skies of Dallas, Texas, that is the only evidence of something having gone disastrously wrong. That which you are seeing right now on your screen, it would appear that it is pieces of the Space Shuttle Columbia having broken apart 200,000 feet approximately above the Earth's surface. I want to bring back in Bob Moulter. He is calling in to us from Texas. He is an eyewitness to this event as well as an audio witness. Bob, people may be just joining us again. It is the top of the hour. Can you recap again for us, sir, what you saw, what you heard, what led you to believe there was some sort of a catastrophe in the making in the first place?
Certainly. At approximately 8:09 this morning, my house began to shake very, very violently. And there was a loud roar, an extremely loud roar. And I live very close to a major railroad line, and so I walked out the front to see if possibly there was smoke in the sky from an explosion or something of that nature, but this roar continued on. And out of the corner of my eye, I caught something in the sky. I looked up, and there were large spirals, like smoke plumes, that were waving back and forth that had come out of the the northwest, headed southeast. And within a very short period of time, I say within a minute and a half, it disappeared down towards the sun, so I lost track of it. However, the roar had continued throughout that entire time, diminishing, as it went further away from us.
Bob, the debris that you were seeing, was it in a concentrated area, or was it fanned out across your area of vision there in the horizon?
Again, it's difficult to say, looking up at the vastness of the sky. But normally, if you see like a jet traveling, it's in a straight line, and you might say it's an inch wide. In comparison, I would say that this was probably, 15 feet wide or 20 feet wide. And as I say, it was just making swirls as it went towards the southeast.
Completely out of control. There was nothing planned about that flight pattern.
No. And immediately I called my wife at work and said, did you hear that or see anything or feel it? And she said, yes, the building shook, but they didn't see it, and they heard it for the roar for about the same duration. They hadn't seen anything because they were inside. And she said, turn on the TV. And I looked for a local news station. Nothing was on.
Right.
Flipped on to CNN. And within a matter of a minute or less, you came up with breaking news.
Yes, we did.
And I realized exactly what we had just seen.
Have you heard any reports or been able to visually see, Bob, evidence of pieces of the shuttle landing anywhere on the ground?
Not from my location, no.
Okay. Bob, I'm going to ask you to stand by if you would, sir. I want to bring back in Richard Berenson. He's a former NASA consultant. Richard, have you been listening to Bob's description of what he saw? Does this seem consistent with reports of something catastrophic having happened over the skies of Dallas, Texas?
Unfortunately, it does. It seems exactly consistent of a large craft breaking apart and spiraling out of control. At that altitude, the atmosphere is getting increasingly dense as the craft enters it. And if it was simply stress and strain on the craft, an aged craft, and that's what caused the fissure, that's when you would expect it to occur, and it'd be exactly the scenario he described. On the other hand, you could certainly understand the interest of the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I can surely imagine the FBI, which investigates any legal issues regarding NASA, of whether or not there might have been any sort of tampering with the craft prior to its launch.
A couple of things to that end, Richard, I want to bring our viewers up to date with. This was an historic launching. There were 7 astronauts on board, among them the very first Israeli astronaut to be put into space, Ilan Ramon. He was the payload specialist on board the Space Shuttle Columbia. And in the history of the launched flights there had never been more security, including the security that was present following the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger back in 1986 with that next shuttle flight. Never had there been the kind of security evident as there was 16 days ago with the launch of Space Shuttle Columbia. It's also important to note, on the heels of the Space Shuttle itself and how well it is in terms of its age. On launch day, a piece of insulating foam on the external fuel tank came off during liftoff, we're told. It was believed to have struck the left wing of the shuttle. However, looking at that, Leroy Kane, he is the lead flight director in Mission Control, he assured reporters that the engineers concluded any damage to the wing was considered minor. It posed no safety hazard. Does that surprise you, Richard Berenson, knowing what you're able to do? How accurately, within a mission that's already launched and up in space, can flight engineers look at something like that and determine, oh, it's okay? Are they able to do it as well as they should be able to do it?
Well, you're dealing with very experienced, knowledgeable people, but they're making an educated guess, truth be known. And, there were hairline fractures, and what ultimately was found to be the problem with the O-rings, going back to the Challenger problem when the teacher in space died. There will be a thorough investigation of this. There may be some small fracture problem like that, and this was an early indication even during liftoff. But we've had no prior experience with this ever happening. As you pointed out, on reentry, there has never been a problem of this sort. And so they were dealing with a zero database. They had no experience ever happening, even in tests. So this would be a first if that's what it was.
This would be a first. And talk about the importance of looking at the age of the Space Shuttle Columbia. It was launched first back in 1981, so more than 20 years ago. It has gone through at least 50 sets of improvements, updates, overhauls, repairs. Is that consistent with what you would expect to be the case for a shuttle this old?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And so the age alone would immediately make you think that there might well be some weakness in one of these joints, but the number of repairs and refurbishings almost makes it a new craft again. So instinct and intuition doesn't tell you the story. This is going to require a very thorough analysis.
How difficult is it, Richard, to get that kind of analysis when you're looking at little bits and pieces potentially and spread out over a vast area? For example, with regard to the Challenger explosion back in 1986, how long did it take NASA to provide a conclusive report, the definitive report on what went wrong?
Well, at first it was appearing to take a very long period of time, and then the brilliance of just a handful of scientists, one in particular from Caltech, led to the solution of what the problem was. But in this case, it's going to be a matter of retrieving that debris, which is, at the moment, as NASA's already reported, the public should keep away from. But government authorities will go in and find every piece they can find, but it may be scattered over tens, maybe even hundreds of square miles, and then they will assemble all that into probably a large hangar and then try to reconstruct whatever happened. That will be a very laborious, time-intensive process. In the meantime, I'm sure the Pentagon, the FBI, and others will want a quicker answer of whether there might have been sabotage. And if there were, how could it possibly have occurred given the very tight security?
Richard, we should also tell you and our viewers that Pentagon officials are saying that both NORAD and the Space Command in Colorado Springs and Air Force Strategic Command in Omaha, they are all involved right now in attempting to determine what happened, to locate any possible Columbia survivors or wreckage. Of course, the key thing right there, survivors. Richard, looking at the pictures, looking at the facts as we know it from the last time that Space Shuttle Columbia was in touch with Mission Control, 200,000 feet in the air, traveling at 12,500 miles per hour. Do you believe there is a chance for survivors?
Well, when you're talking about life, you don't want to be pessimistic, of course, and there are loved ones and family members out there who are praying, literally praying at this moment. But realistically, no, it doesn't appear that they could have survived.
And you mentioned the concern, sabotage, that sort of thing. Would that be possible amidst the kind of security that was reported to have been in place for the Space Shuttle Columbia?
It seems utterly unimaginable. This has been checked so very many times, and the security was so astonishingly tight. It is for all of the shuttle launches, and they were also aware, given the Israeli
This is Mission Control, Houston. A space shuttle contingency has been declared in Mission Control due to the loss of communication from the Space Shuttle Columbia that occurred at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time this morning as Columbia was descending toward a landing planned at the Kennedy Space Center to occur at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. At the time that communication was lost, Columbia was above the north central Texas area at an altitude of approximately 200,000 feet. No communications or tracking data was received from Columbia since that time. Search and rescue forces have been alerted in the north central Texas vicinity and eastern Texas. Any persons in those areas reporting debris should avoid any debris that may be associated with the Space Shuttle's contingency, as it may be hazardous and toxic due to the toxic nature of propellants that are used on board the shuttle. Any such debris that is located should also be reported as quickly as possible to local law enforcement agencies. Again, a Space Shuttle contingency has been declared in Mission Control. Flight controllers here are securing all information and data pertinent to today's descent by the Space Shuttle Columbia. The last communications from which were received at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time. This is Mission Control, Houston.
Richard Berenson, I just want to remind you that we did kill your microphone as soon as we got the word Mission Control was up and talking again. We will continue to have to do so. I'm sorry to have cut you off, but sir, we were speculating together at the promise, the hope, the possibility of there being survivors among those 7 astronauts on board the Space Shuttle Columbia. I'd like to ask you to reiterate what you were saying and your speculation on that possibility.
Well, when there's human beings involved and loved ones on the ground praying for their return, of course we want to hold out for all hope. And you never know. There are backup systems for the escape of the astronauts in the case of a disaster, and so we just don't know. But given the conditions here, the altitude, the speed, and the breakup fragments, as you've seen in the video footage, it seems highly unlikely that anyone could have survived this. As for the security issues on liftoff, they were the tightest in history, in part because they've gotten increasingly tight since 9/11, and because there was an Israeli astronaut aboard. There's a great deal being made out of it being an Israeli astronaut. Should emphasize
to be able to know where it came down before you declared something, even though nobody thinks the shuttle survived. And I don't see how a crew could have gotten out of a breakup at that altitude. They have pressure suits on, but those are SR-71 spy plane type pressure suits. They're only good from, you know, under 100,000 feet. At that altitude, I don't think they would save anyone, even if you could get out. And certainly at that speed, they're not designed to exit a spacecraft going at Mach 12, which is what I believe they said, 12 times the speed of sound, or 12,000 miles an hour, I believe they said. So I don't think they could have gotten out. I think NASA just wants to make
it was almost directly ahead of me, and the contrail was actually fairly wide, about, it looked like it was probably 3 times the size of a normal contrail of a hot plane. And then it went, let's see, it probably went across a good almost 90 degrees across the sky.
So it started out much more intact and then began to spread out as it was coming into
spread out, and pieces we could see little, at first little small glimmering pieces and then larger pieces coming off.
Tell me about the sound. What did you hear?
We didn't hear a thing because we were driving in our truck, and over the engine noises and everything, couldn't hear a thing.
Janet, could you see any kind of impact on the ground of any of these pieces?
No, it didn't impact the ground. It actually broke up while still up in the sky, and you could see the pieces going down, but eventually, you know, they sort of faded because there was no more contrail or anything.
Janet, we're told that Mission Control, NASA system-wide, is telling local citizens that could come into contact with pieces of debris to be very careful, to not touch it, rather report that you've seen this. Are you hearing that over perhaps the radio, news reports in your car, anything like that?
Yes, the Dallas stations are saying do not touch the debris, leave it alone, notify law enforcement officials if they see it. Part of the reason that I'm concerned about this is I grew up there by the Manned Spacecraft Center, Johnson Space Center, and, you know a great deal. That's why I used to go out and observe meteorites and things like that. That's why I was, you know, this thing caught my eye at first.
Right, but you very quickly established that this was no meteorite.
No, this was not. At first I thought it was a large piece of space debris coming in, but I usually try to keep in touch and know when something's scheduled to come down, and then it hit me after it had gone down that the shuttle was scheduled to land.
All right. Janet, I'm going to ask you to continue standing by, if you don't mind. We thank you for your time this morning. Let's go back now to Richard Berenson, former NASA consultant and an expert in this area. Richard, with regard to, you know, the possibility of survivors, it's the kind of thing that it's certainly pulling at my heart right now, and I don't want to be the person to say it looks impossible. I turn to you for that because you have far more knowledge here. Do you think any of these 7 astronauts that we're looking at right now on our screen have a chance of surviving?
Well, I don't want to be the one to say negative things either. It seems highly unlikely. Let's put it this way. NASA tries to build in safety protocols redundantly so that if there's any possibility of a crisis that there will be survivors. But in this case, at this altitude, at this speed, with the kind of fragmentation that you've had reported, it seems highly unlikely.
If there was, I'm assuming that the 7 astronauts are in one encapsulated area together as they go back into re-entry on the space shuttle. Is that the case, or are they in separate areas of the shuttle?
No, they would have probably been pretty close together, but this is breaking apart. There's so much fissure. The strains on that craft at this point would have been so great, the speed so great, the atmosphere is so thick. It's a little hard to say intuitively exactly what would have happened. This thing probably was tumbling completely out of control, in which case you just don't know what would have happened.
Richard, something as just the angle, the tilt, of course, people that are fans of movies that go in this kind of science genre will know that you always see that played up in a film. In real life, does it have to be that?
Coming by, we also noticed, because it seemed awful close, a plane pretty close to it, but we didn't see any kind of impact.
All right, Benjamin, I'm sorry. Can I interrupt you because I'm having a hard time hearing you? They keep talking to me. Did you say there's a plane nearby?
It was a plane nearby the shuttle as it was going.
No, I'm not talking to the producer in the control room. Please be quiet in the control room for 1 minute. I want to talk to Benjamin. Benjamin, you said a plane was nearby?
It seemed like a plane was nearby. It sure did. As it was going by, I said, ooh, that's awful close. That's what we said, you know, that plane being that close.
What sort of plane, Benjamin?
It looked like a commercial jet. I mean, it was...
Oh, all right. So this could have just been a coincidence, seeing it. Or would you normally see a commercial jet in that area at where you saw it?
I guess you would, but not that close to the shuttle. I mean...
Well, when you say how close to the shuttle, how close do you mean?
Well, I mean, looking from where I was looking, it seemed like they were awful close, and I mean, it just seemed like they was awful close, like it could have been even a close call, but you know, we didn't notice anything from there. But then after we was on the front porch, the house kind of shook, and we noticed a sonic boom that kind of shook the house. At least we thought it was a sonic boom, but you know, I don't know. And then we seen a big continuous puff of vapor or smoke stream come out, and then we noticed a big chunk go over, and that's what we saw.
All right, Benjamin Lester, joining us from that part of Central Texas. And we should caution our viewers, and this is no reflection on Mr. Lester or anybody else we're going to be hearing from, but frequently we get witness accounts at this juncture of any incident, plane crash, whatever it may be, that do not bear themselves out. The fact that an airplane was nearby, I should tell you that the space shuttle was at an altitude of 200,000 feet. So even if there was a commercial airliner or any sort of airplane in that area, it would have been significantly lower. So we'll just leave that at that. Thank you, Benjamin. Let's go to CNN's Suzanne Malveaux at the White House. And apparently the president has been at Camp David. They've set up a bit of a task force within the government to try to go through all this and get a sense of what happened. And he will be on his way to the White House right around the noon hour to, you know, get a full, his hands on the reins here in order to get a sense of what's going on and how to proceed as the investigation begins very early. Now, Gene Meserve told us, and it's very... I want to caution that we mention terrorism in this day and age always when things like this happen, because the sad fact is that is a part of our life right now. But the initial indication that we have from Gene Meserve, who has, I'll highlight it if, assuming it is through the telestrator now, and I'm hoping that's the case. You see the shuttle right there. What's significant about this is that is exactly what you would expect to see. A bright dot, and then one, you know, the term contrail doesn't really apply because that's kind of streaking plasma, superheated, ionized air. Don't want to get too technical with you, but that's basically what we're talking about at that altitude. Now, I believe this next one is the next one in the series, although I'm not positive.
What you see there is a very bright flash right at the center there. Clearly something very, as NASA's term would be, extremely dynamic occurred at that point. What you also see are a series of little dots all around. I don't want to cover it over, so I'll take it out. But you see those little dots? That is debris. And clearly that is, there's no mistaking what that is. That is in-flight breakup, straight and forward. And finally, although I'm not sure this is the correct order, what you see are two very significant targets right there. Two big pieces, separated, breakup, 200,000 feet, 6 times the speed of sound. The crew, 7 people. 7 people who all dreamed of flying to space and dreamed of doing what they're doing. The crew led by Commander Rick Husband and supported by his pilot, William Willie McCool. And as we look at more pictures, this is the WFAA tape, which shows you what I just showed you in still form. All right. We have, we're getting all kinds of, let's listen to James Hartsfield in Houston for a minute, if we could.
Mission control as a result of the loss of communication with the Space Shuttle Columbia this morning at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time as Columbia was descending toward a landing in Florida. At the time, Columbia was at an altitude of approximately 200,000 feet above north-central Texas. No communications or tracking from Columbia has been received by Mission Control since that time. Search and rescue authorities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in portions of East Texas and other pertinent areas have been alerted to the Space Shuttle contingency. Any debris that is found that may be related to the Space Shuttle's contingency should be avoided and may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants that are used on board the Space Shuttle. The locations of any possible debris should be reported immediately to local law enforcement authorities. In Mission Control, flight controllers continue through contingency procedures designed to secure all information, data, and notes pertinent to today's descent of the Space Shuttle Columbia. This is Mission Control, Houston.
Call any of those people. All right, that was James Hartsfield in Houston giving us an update, Public Affairs Officer for NASA, sitting in the control room. You see screen left, screen right, you see tape of the final minutes of the Space Shuttle Columbia on its 28th
flight. They didn't change anything about today's entry. They weren't at all concerned. Up until the moment they lost communications, there was no telemetry from the orbiter that indicated anything out of the ordinary, at least that we're aware of. So much telemetry comes into Mission Control. There could be somebody down there by now who has some hint of what happened, but we haven't been told that.
And Bill, what about, there were some words after this shuttle mission had been launched about when the fuel tanks went apart from the shuttle, some little piece of something got loose. Let's review that.
Right, that's what I was mentioning during the launch sequence, when some foam insulation came off and hit the leading edge of the wing. I don't believe the shuttle had even gone through the sound barrier at that point. It was right over the pad fairly early in launch. They could see it hit the wing, but because that material is very lightweight, they didn't think that it would have caused any significant damage at all. Of course, if they're wrong, and there was significant damage there, the heat loads this experiences, and I'm using engineering speak, it just means they get very high temperatures on the leading edge of the wing during re-entry because of that. Dan, I think he's recapping what they've been saying. To answer your question, if the shuttle broke apart or suffered a catastrophic failure at an altitude of 200,000 feet, which is when they lost communications, the bailout system they have for getting away would not have saved their lives. If, however, they lost communications for some other reason and the shuttle was able to continue descending to a lower altitude before a catastrophic failure occurred, then that is within the realm of possibility. But at 200,000 feet, the system they have would not have saved them.
Bill Harwood, our veteran CBS News expert on the space program, reporting from Florida. Russ Mitchell, there are some eyewitnesses who are beginning to speak up and speak out now.
We have spoken with a few this morning. I'm going to go back to one we talked to about 30 minutes ago. Rob Perillo is in Lafayette, Louisiana. Mr. Perillo, you there?
Yes, I am, Russ.
Good morning to you, sir. Tell us once again what you heard, what you saw this morning.
Right, well, just a little background information. I'm a local meteorologist at KLFY, and we usually play up if the shuttle's going to be coming in overhead during the course of its missions that are not space station specific. And we were looking off into the west-northwestern sky, pretty much anticipating where it was going to come in. Usually it comes across here about 12 or 14 minutes before it makes a landing over at the Kennedy Space Center. And we picked it up. I got it on my video camera, and by the time I had it focused on my video camera, I started to see multiple plumes, kind of like the video that we're seeing right now. As I watched it, it really then took a hard left from where we're seeing this angle's out of Dallas. It took a left, like debris had actually certainly obliterated, and then whatever debris was left, for some reason it went off to the left. I don't know why it did that. Atmospheric conditions indicate that there's a little bit of a westerly wind, perhaps a west-southwest wind aloft. And interestingly enough, I just checked some of the National Weather Service radars out of Dallas, Lake Charles, Fort Polk. They're all picking up a plume that extends from just south of Dallas into the vicinity, crossing Toledo Bend in Texas, and somewhere over Vernon Parish, that's in western Louisiana. Roughly, Lafayette's about 100 miles from the Texas border.
Mr. Perillo, it's Dan Rather with Russ Mitchell. You said that you were taking some video of this, some home video?
Yeah, my home video is a little bit cruder, but it's certainly picked up pretty much at this point. And at that point, once again, you know, your emotion is like you can't believe what you're actually seeing. And unfortunately, I kind of knew what was happening at that time. I went to the NASA website, and it was quiet there for about a minute, and pretty much knew what had happened.
Well, we of course would like to see that video, and if I may, I'll have someone be in touch with you about that. Thank you.
We'll upload it to you.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and we'll have somebody do it. But I want, if you can stay with us just a moment more, I want to take you back to the first seconds when the shuttle came into view. Take me from the very first moment you saw it to the moment you thought something was wrong, and tell me what you saw.
Sure, Dan. Basically, from Lafayette, believe it or not, we can see the shuttle when it's somewhere around the Dallas vicinity. And at that point, my wife and daughter had spotted it as I was getting my camera set up, and it was a singular ball, what we're seeing right now. Normally, that's what we see. We see a streaking plasma streak across the sky here in southern Louisiana. I wasn't sure if we were actually going to be able to see it an hour after sunrise, so sure enough, we did see it. And at this point, when I saw multiple things breaking off, and then I completely lost it on the camera, I took my eye off the camera, and there was nothing left but a smoke plume. So obviously, it fell off our, not only our viewing screen, but off our visual screen as well. Couldn't see it on binoculars either. Following that, normally when we see the space shuttle come on in, we'll hear the sonic boom a few minutes later, and it's usually a singular sonic boom, and nothing overly too loud. This time it seemed to be a much longer, protracted sonic boom with multiple announcements going maybe 7 or 8 times, indicating maybe multiple pieces of debris coming into the atmosphere.
Mr. Perillo, I believe it was... Hold on for 1 second. We're going to listen to Mission Control here. Perhaps
8 a.m. Central Time, as it flew at an altitude of 200,000 feet and a speed of approximately 12,500 miles per hour.
Mr. Perillo, let me ask you, I believe when we spoke with you earlier, you had told us you were an amateur astronomer. It's picking up on Dan's question. At what point did you realize that something was wrong?
Immediately, Russ, immediately. When you see that come in and you see more than one smoke plume, you know there's more than one thing coming in, burning into the atmosphere. And unfortunately, just like everybody else, it's kind of, and I remember the Challenger accident, same type of feeling, only knowing with my background and knowing what I know, I was pretty sure of what had occurred, and that's when I raced back into my house to check the NASA website, and it was dead silence there for the next minute.
Mr. Rod Perillo in Lafayette, Louisiana, we thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
We're going to check in very quickly now with Mark Knoller, who's at the White House, to tell us who knows what there and what they know. Mark?
Good morning, Dan. President Bush is at Camp David this morning. He went there last evening after his meetings with Prime Minister Tony Blair. We're told that the president has been briefed on the space shuttle situation. He was briefed
in Athens and Rusk, Texas. I want to bring back in NBC News correspondent and Dallas Bureau Chief Jim Cummins. Jim, you're very familiar with the area, but it doesn't seem to me like Athens and Rusk are large cities. Do you know where they are in Texas and how far you are away from there right now as you motor towards Palestine, another debris field?
Well, that's one of the things I'm going to do. I'm going to detour and get my map out to make sure I'm not headed in the wrong direction. But they are both very small towns, again, not large cities. We're talking about a rural area, and it's definitely south and east of Dallas. That's the best I could tell you. But it is not a largely populated area, though, although I must say, as the city of Dallas continues to grow, and it grows very fast, you see more and more people who are, moving into those areas. So there are probably more people there than used to be, say, 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But it is an area with a lot of open spaces.
All right, that's good news in terms of the ability of people or things being hit by this, what appears to be a vast area of debris. We've had eyewitnesses tell us that at the outset, when they first heard the noise, looked up in the sky, they saw a large piece of something which began to splinter apart. Once again, we're going to bring in Mission Control, listen to them with our sound full on what they're saying, and join you on the other side.
Designed to secure all information, notes, and data pertinent to today's descent by the Space Shuttle Columbia. Communications were lost with the Space Shuttle Columbia at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time, as Columbia was above north-central Texas at an altitude of 200,000 feet, traveling approximately 12,500 miles per hour. Search and rescue forces in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in other portions along Columbia's planned route have been alerted to the Space Shuttle program contingency. Any debris that may be found that may be related to the Space Shuttle contingency should be immediately reported to local authorities and avoided. Debris may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants used on board the Space Shuttle. Further information will be released as it becomes available. This is Mission Control, Houston.
All right, you heard Mission Control Houston talking about the debris field. We are getting our first reports from an eyewitness in Nacogdoches, Texas. We're being told there is a piece of shuttle debris in the Commercial Bank parking lot there. The area is completely roped off. Once again, Arby McCallie, she is an eyewitness there and reporting that in Nacogdoches, Texas, the shuttle debris, first report specifically of something. This is in the Commercial Bank parking lot there. Of course, in keeping with NASA Mission Control, people are being asked to stay away from that area. If you look at the map right now, you're seeing on our screen Nacogdoches, Texas, in the central eastern part of the state of Texas, there to the north of Houston, not too far from the border of Louisiana. This would be consistent with the area above which Natchitoches, I'm being told, I've been corrected, my pronunciation there, Natchitoches, but I'm being told that the shuttle was lost contact with Mission Control there over the central part of Texas, the eastern central part, so it would appear that debris is now coming down and landing in that area and being discovered from Natchitoches, Texas, the Commercial Bank parking lot. We're also told that the president is going to be departing Camp David shortly in a motorcade. He will be heading back to the White House to confer with officials about this catastrophe for NASA today in the obvious destruction of the Space Shuttle Columbia. We're also told that National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice has already entered the White House. She is already there awaiting the president's arrival. Also coming up for you in less than, well, about 35 minutes or so, NASA is going to have a newser at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. We will be bringing it to you live, of course. We will have reaction from experts with us. We have NBC News science correspondent Robert Bazell following this. Jay Barbary, our man at NASA for years and years now. He had been following this for us throughout the morning, and we had anticipated a wonderful review of the Space Shuttle landing at 9:16 a.m. Eastern Time. Jay is always so animated and makes it always so interesting for us. Sadly, Jay came on the air with us shortly before that time to let us know that NASA was in. These pieces are, Richard, I don't know if you're in front of the television watching as well, but from this vantage point, they seem to be in tandem together. It looks like two separate pieces of a part of the Space Shuttle Columbia having merged and then breaking apart, perhaps even more. Can you guess, Richard, as to how big a piece of the Space Shuttle Columbia that might be, that fireball we see in the middle of the sky?
Communications were lost with Columbia at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time as the space shuttle was at an altitude of 200,000 feet above north-central Texas, traveling at a speed of approximately 12,500 miles per hour. A space shuttle contingency has been declared in mission control. Search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth vicinity have been alerted, as well as along other portions of Columbia's planned route toward Florida.
Hard to guess. It might be the size of a room, but on the other hand, this thing is clearly breaking apart into many pieces, and unfortunately it's breaking even into more pieces than that. Given the eyewitness testimony you heard earlier of the large sound of an explosion that could possibly be related to the rockets that are aboard the craft on re-entry, or it could be related to a sonic boom of the craft hitting the atmosphere. After the Challenger disaster in '86, NASA put in elaborate escape mechanisms for the astronauts, but unfortunately, those would only apply if the craft were coming in at a horizontal control position, which this clearly is not.
Richard Berenson, I want to thank you for your time and ask you to continue staying with us. I'm going to bring in now MSNBC anchor Chris Jansing. She has come in on her day off and joins us now. Chris, give us an update on the 7 astronauts, what you know about them, and perhaps what's being done with their families right now.
Well, this obviously is the most tragic of times, and those of us who were in the news business and lived through it with some of the families of the Space Shuttle Challenger can only begin to imagine the heartbreak that is going on in homes across the country, because these astronauts represent not only the entire cross-section of the United States, Alex, but literally from around the world. Many states where they were born and raised, their parents live in different parts all around the country. Several of them are married with children. And you mentioned that one of them is an Israeli astronaut, Colonel Ramon. And at the time that the shuttle launched, and I was giving coverage at that point, I talked to a lot of our folks in our Tel Aviv bureau and some people who I know in Israel. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of this mission to the Israeli people. It was widely covered, and there you see Colonel Ramon at a time when obviously there has been great difficulty and great violence in the Middle East. As it was described to me by people who live in Israel, this was one of the great moments that they could ever remember. He had become a celebrity. His family had become celebrities. He is married. He has 4 children. His mother is a Holocaust survivor. His father did not survive the Holocaust. And when he was going into space, he told television in Israel that he felt he was representing the whole Jewish people. The astronauts are allowed to carry with them into space some personal items, and among the 9 personal items that Colonel Ramon carried was a small pencil drawing by a 14-year-old who was killed at Auschwitz. His parents live in a kibbutz in Israel, and he and his wife Rona, well known in Israel, frequently on television and quoted in newspapers there, have 4 children. He has a wife and 2 children. This morning, Rick Husband, Colonel Ramon, and the other astronauts were all awakened, what has become tradition, in which many of us have heard on these missions before, the morning wake-up, and we have that tape for you. We're going to play it now.
Good morning to the red team. That was Scotland the Brave for Laurel.
Well, good morning, Houston. We're getting ready for a big day up here. Had a great time on orbit and really excited to come back home. Hearing that song reminds me of all the different places down on Earth and all the friends and family that I have all over the world. Thanks, and it's been great working with you and all the other folks.
Eastern Time, at the Kennedy Space Center.
That was Laurel Clark. She is a Navy physician. In the past, she has worked undersea. She's 41 years old, and she was a diving medical officer aboard submarines. Then she was a naval flight surgeon before becoming a part of NASA. She actually became an astronaut back in 1996, and there you can see the information on our screen. She had never been on a space flight before. She was part of helping with Columbia's science experiments, and these actually, much like the case of Colonel Ramon, should have flown almost 2 years ago. She's from Racine, Wisconsin, and her parents live in New Mexico. And since I mentioned Colonel Ramon and how much pride Israel had, his father was actually watching this morning. This has gotten extensive coverage in all the media in Israel, and this is Colonel Ramon's father watching. I'm told we do not have that tape. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the other American astronauts on board this flight. William McCool, also married, also an astronaut since 1996, a Navy commander, former test pilot. This was also his first space flight. He was 41 years old. He grew up in Lubbock, Texas, and he charmed a lot of people who follow the space program because he told them that one of the most nerve-wracking parts of training was that he had to learn to draw blood from his fellow astronauts, that Columbia's 2 pilots are actually exempted from invasive medical tests in orbit, so they're the ones who have to do the blood draws, and he said that that was very difficult for him to do, to think about inflicting pain on others. And I'm told now that Colonel Ramon's father, the tape that we have of him earlier today when he was watching, we have. Let's watch.
בשלבי הנחיתה, ובכן עד היום הדבר הגרוע ביותר שקרה בנחיתות אי פעם היה במעבורות המאוישות, היה שבזמן...
Obviously, this tape is in Hebrew. His father is also well known in Israel, as Colonel Ramon's entire family has become. His father was a Zionist who fought for Israel's statehood. And actually, the astronaut himself also fought for his country in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and then in Lebanon in 1982. Just very briefly, I want to go over the other astronauts who are on board today. Michael Anderson is married. He is from Spokane, Washington. Kalpana Chawla went to high school in India, was born and raised in India, and then emigrated to the United States in the 80s. She said flying in space was the last thing on her mind, but this was her second space flight. David Brown, something of a Navy novelty, both a jet pilot and an MD, and probably the only NASA astronaut to have worked as a circus acrobat. It was a summer job he had during college. 46 years old, he's from Virginia, and his parents live in Washington, Virginia. So that is a brief thumbnail sketch of the crew of 7 of Columbia, 6 Americans and 1 Israeli. Alex?
So, Chris, I thank you very much for that. We will check back in with you for updates both on these people and their loved ones and where those families are in just a little bit. I want to let all of you know that the President's senior staff is now at the White House. The President will be returning to the White House. He should be there in a little more than an hour from now. The White House is going to let NASA address this issue. It is coming up in a live news conference at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. That is less than half an hour from now. We, of course, are carrying that for you live. You'll want to stick with us for that. Also, the President is considering speaking following that, but again, he will let NASA address the nation previously and give us an update on to what has happened with the Space Shuttle Columbia. Right now, I'm joined by former Shuttle Commander Rick Houck. Commander Houck was the shuttle commander for the very first shuttle following the disaster in 1986 of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Commander Houck, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much for being here. Tell me what you detect may be the problem here, sir. You've been in the shuttle. You know exactly what happens upon re-entry. Give us a scenario of what some of the potential problems are at that time.
Well, of course, it's all speculative at this point, but you can think of several possibilities, all of which you would think would be remote, but with anything that would have caused a breakup of the space shuttle would probably be an aerodynamic breakup. In other words, the space shuttle is designed so that it comes into the Earth's atmosphere at about this kind of an attitude, 40 degrees from the relative wind. And if it got crossways to that, for any reason, the aerodynamic pressures would cause some kind of a breakup. And the only way that this shuttle can maintain pointed in the proper direction is the firing of rocket control, reaction control jets that are right here. This does not fly like an airplane until it's subsonic, which is right overhead the field, which would be Kennedy Space Center in this case. So something may have happened that made this deviate from its flight path, and the increased pressure of that wind could have caused a disruption.
Commander Houck, you mentioned that the only way to rectify a situation like that is to use those two jets in the back of the shuttle. Is it not possible to fire those up again upon re-entry?
Well, the problem is that if you deviate from that optimum attitude, you will have some roll and pitch deviations, and you will have a problem that would not be recoverable.
In this case, sir, how much off-kilter can cause a problem? Is it tiny degrees? Is it feet? Is it inches? Can you put this into perspective for us?
I would say just a few degrees. Just a few degrees.
A few degrees. And upon having a disaster like that, what would happen? Would the shuttle, would it heat up? We've seen, you know, things, again, my experience only, and for the majority of those viewers right now from movies and the like, certainly nothing along the likes of your experience. Does it get very hot? Would that precede any kind of a breakup?
Well, that's, we can, again, as we speculate, heat is certainly a factor. If it wasn't a problem with the reaction control jets, there may have been a problem with the tiles, the thermal tiles that are on the bottom of the space shuttle to protect it from that heat. Remember that the space shuttle's coming in at 25 times the speed of sound, decelerating, and that movement through the air, in fact, heats, the friction heats the space shuttle. The nose gets up to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The leading edge of the wings get up to very high temperatures. On the bottom are these little silica tiles, and one of the concerns that you always have is whether some of those tiles somehow get dislodged at some point, and then if one goes and two goes, then you worry about a zipper effect. And so for scenario number 2, if in fact you still have a good stable space shuttle, if you're exposed to the heat of re-entry, then you worry about the heat melting the aluminum subskin and heat penetrating into some of the critical systems.
Commander Houck, if the commander...
saying that something went through his offices. Again, 200,000 feet above the Earth, the shuttle going at a rate of over 12,000 miles an hour, Mach 18 times the speed of sound. And they have warned people, NASA has, to keep away from this debris. Of course, this kind of thing anybody would be glad to keep away from, but when you see it lying out in a field or in a street, they're warning people to stay away from that. And as you can see here, they are roping off, again, live pictures back in Nacogdoches, Texas, the tape surrounding more debris, and there seems to be a considerable amount.
You know what's interesting, Bob, is that this morning and last night, a lot of people, I guess, have been listening to reports on local radio and television telling them that the shuttle was going to be flying over this part of Texas. So at 8 o'clock in the morning, their time, Central Time, there were a lot of people out. And then a lot, and that makes it even luckier, I think, that nobody was really badly injured, with the exception perhaps of these 27 or so people in Nacogdoches who came too close to this one particularly large piece of debris, not knowing what it was, and before they knew, made contact and perhaps suffered some burns. Those people, by the way, apparently they went to the emergency room, they went to the hospital, but any of the injuries that they might have suffered were minor, and they were sent home. But certainly a lot of people, as you can see, still gathered around, still curious, and I guess it's a natural instinct when you see something like that to go over to it and to try to investigate a little bit. But authorities have been saying throughout the day, stay away from it, treat it as really a piece of evidence in perhaps solving this horrible tragedy of what's happened today. And again, the number you see on the screen there, 1-800-525-5555, if you do spot any more debris.
And of course, this is a technical disaster for NASA, but a personal one as well. Rick Husband was the commander of this flight of the Shuttle Columbia. And we're joined now on the phone by Greg Ojakankis. He is a physics professor at Drury University and knew Rick Husband. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Give us a feel. What do you know about Rick? Let us know a little bit more personally about him.
Well, Rick was a very very obviously gifted and extremely well qualified to be an astronaut. He was a test pilot and had a long list of credentials. But I met him as one of a group of finalists for the astronaut selection process back in 1994. So we went through a week of tests together, different various to various degrees, invasive medical tests and mental tests and so on during this astronaut selection procedure, and so we came to be kind of bonded at that point. And he was very encouraging to me when I was not selected as an astronaut, and he was. We shared a common faith in God, and we emailed back and forth afterwards. He allowed me to list him as a reference for my own application. And he was very encouraging, humble, warm. He's a family man. He was concerned about not having enough time with his family, and so he was just a wonderful person.
Yeah, as we look at a picture of him here, a colonel in the U.S. Air Force, married with 2 children. And from what we understand, he liked the water skiing, the snow skiing, cycling, a very active gentleman. And I don't believe this was his first try to be an astronaut, and it sounds like from what you're describing, it's very competitive, and if at first you don't succeed, obviously a lot of people are trying again.
That's right. They nominally, NASA selects astronauts every 2 years or so. The cycle is sometimes delayed, as it has been recently, but every couple of years they select about a dozen to 2 dozen astronauts, generally speaking. And he was not selected the first time that he was interviewed, and he commiserated with me and talked to me about how, hey, it's when it's God's will, it'll happen, and we all have to realize we have got a pretty good job where we are, and to just not take it too hard when you're not selected. But he'd been an astronaut since 1995 when just after the selection process that I was involved in. And this was his second mission, and first as a commander.
Found what seemed to be body parts, a charred torso, it said, a thigh bone, and a skull on a rural road in Hemphill, Texas. This is right near the Louisiana line. Of course, a lot of the debris did land on the Texas-Louisiana border. Now, the spacecraft had just re-entered the atmosphere, as you know, and it had reached the point at which it was subjected to its highest temperature when it disintegrated. And as we've been telling you, the debris has been scattered throughout Texas, various East Texas counties, and also in Louisiana. NASA's been sending out crews, but again, this report that some human remains have been found near Hemphill in Texas. And again, authorities have been putting out the request to anybody who does come across any of the debris from the shuttle to please stay away from it, but do call authorities at 1-800-525-55. Again, 800-525-5555.
Right now, we're joined by Sean Robb, reporter in Nacogdoches, Texas right now. Sean, what have you seen?
Well, we're in downtown Nacogdoches, and we're here because right here in the parking lot of the Commercial Bank and Trust this morning, a piece of the shuttle came to rest. It's about 3 foot long, maybe a foot wide, and it crashed into the bank building here. And folk from in Nacogdoches County have been coming here all day long. This has become the emotional epicenter for people who are grieving here over this horrible tragedy that's taken place today. People have been coming, bringing flowers and sitting around. If you look to my left, your right, you'll see a group of people with flowers. They've been sitting for probably 2 hours, just kind of mourning the event, and it's been that way all day long here in downtown Nacogdoches. One lady said to me, this was the September 11th event for folks here in Nacogdoches, Texas. Outside of downtown, law enforcement have been very, very busy in this county, this southeast Texas county. I can tell you there are at least 500 debris fields that have been verified. At each one of those, local law enforcement have been the first responders. They put up police caution tape, cordoned off the area, and they stand guard until a member of the National Guard can then show up and post up in those positions, trying to preserve the integrity of the debris that remains. There have been as many people who have shared sorrow today, many others who have been seeking souvenirs. So there have been people actually picking up pieces of debris, actually taking pieces of the shuttle with them from debris fields. As we've heard all day, NASA officials have been encouraging people not to do that. At least 24 people were treated at Memorial Hospital here in Nacogdoches, coming in, some for burns because they picked up pieces of debris, others fearful of being exposed to some sort of hazardous material. Of course, lots of scientific experiments on that shuttle, lots of exotic chemicals, if you will, and people have actually come to the hospital with pieces of debris saying, hey, is this dangerous? I picked this up. Is it radioactive? Am I in danger? Again, they've been imploring folks not to pick up what you find or see. I can also tell you there are many homes that have pieces of debris embedded in the roof or in the wall or in the backyard. Texas is a place, a mixture of both urban and rural communities. In this part of our state, a lot of rural communities. Some people have farms. On those farms, many barns have pieces of debris, again, in the roof. And at this point, there's been no activity to remove any of that from anybody's home. At this point, everything is simply being preserved. I would imagine in the next day or so, while the weather is still good here before the next front moves in, that officials will move to try to get those pieces of debris. But the most interesting thing has been folks' desire to come here and share. Strangers hugging and crying and talking about the grief they felt in what is not just a national tragedy, but indeed because of the Israeli astronaut, the first Israeli astronaut, this is in fact an international tragedy. And of course this week, quietly, the anniversary of the Space Shuttle Challenger on January 28th, then President Reagan reminded our nation that those 7 brave astronauts slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. Today, 7 more astronauts have seen God's face. In Nacogdoches, Sean Rabb, Fox News.
Sean, thank you very much.
All right, we want to bring you back to the events of this morning. If you're tuning in after maybe a little bit of a break from watching television, just take you back to those horrible minutes this morning when we realized that we had lost another 7 astronauts. This, by the way, was Columbia beginning its final mission some 16 days ago is when it took off, and there was a lot of hoopla around it, of course, because of the first Israeli astronaut on board. Now, it broke apart in flames upon re-entry. This is said to be obviously such a critical stage and such a difficult point. We've had a lot of experts essentially explaining that if one tiny thing goes wrong, well, all bets are off, and they certainly were this morning. This happened when the shuttle was about 203,000 feet, roughly 39 miles over Texas, 9 o'clock in the morning, just 60 minutes before it was supposed to make its touchdown in Florida, traveling at 12,500 miles per hour, 18 times the speed of sound. There was a final radio transmission between Mission Control and the shuttle, and it didn't seem to give any sort of indication of trouble. Mission Control radioed, Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages and we did not copy your last. And then Columbia's commander, Rick Husband, responded quite calmly, Roger, and then another syllable, and then the transmission goes silent, and then it's followed by static. Of course, there are bound to be many more NASA briefings in the days to come. At this point, they are not drawing any conclusions. They do say they do not think that the age of the shuttle is a factor. Columbia was...
will affect the space program?
Well, I think it'll be a period here where everybody's going to be very concerned about what went wrong, how do you fix it. When the accident happened back in '86, there was a long period where we didn't fly. There was all this investigation. Plus, as they point out in the press conference today, back then, with Russia as a partner, when they were brought in, that brought in a redundant ability to get there. So with their Soyuz capsule, There's a capsule actually attached to the space station now. The astronauts on board can get back in the event of an emergency. It was designed to be serviced by both the shuttle and the Soyuz, and so fortunately, at least the Soyuz can continue to go.
Yeah.
And as I said, depending on what the problem is, perhaps the shuttle can be activated again and fly down the line, but I'm sure it'll be many months before that takes place.
We are looking at new video from northern Texas, from Arlington, Texas, actually, which is close to Dallas. Again, more debris, and of course the shuttle split up over a large area.
Well, that's another difference between this accident and the Challenger, where the Challenger exploded over the water, so you didn't have this quite as much public interaction with the debris and picking things up. And I think that as NASA has stressed, as you've stressed, people shouldn't be touching this stuff, and they certainly shouldn't be trying to save it as souvenirs. What's important is collect as much evidence as possible so that that'll help understand the problem.
Yeah, we appreciate you being with us, sir. Alan Lagweed was the manager of the Teacher in Space program as we look at new video coming in from Texas. Where was this again, producer? Burlington? Okay. This, obviously, again, in Texas, a large area. There have been reports throughout. There were some reports from Arkansas as well as Texas, which we've been seeing, and these are live pictures right now of that debris, again, from the Space Shuttle Columbia, which disintegrated apparently upon re-entry this morning at 8 a.m. Central Time, just after.
All right, and again, as we continue to look at more and more debris being found, I guess it's worth a mention once again, just that people have been asking throughout the day, if you're one of the people who happens upon this, please, notify the authorities. We've been giving out an 800 number throughout the day. They're saying don't touch it, and it's important to point out they're telling you that for a reason. By the way, the 800 number is 800-525. 5555. There were some people in Nacogdoches, as we've been telling you, they came upon some debris, didn't really know what it was, came too close, and then felt that they might have been burned by it. Also, there's the danger of various toxins being a part of this debris. Some of those people went to the hospital, to the ER for treatment, but they were not admitted. It would seem that they are all right. Now, we also had some tough to talk about reports throughout the day that human remains had been found, and indeed the Associated Press just a little while ago reporting that human remains seem to have been found near what is believed to be debris from the Shuttle Columbia. A hospital worker who was on his way to his job has found what seemed to be some body parts. This was on a rural road in Hemphill, Texas, near the Louisiana line, and of course that is where so much of the debris has been found up until this point.
We want to do a little housekeeping here as far as folks, let you know what's coming up on Fox, because obviously this is a story we want to devote all our resources to. Rick Fulbaum's coming up in just a couple minutes. He's going to take over for Bridget and myself. Shepard Smith will be on at 7 o'clock East Coast time. I'm talking here for the Fox Report. At 8 o'clock we have a special with John Scott. 9 o'clock again, East Coast time, Geraldo Rivera will be on. And at 10 o'clock, Greta Van Susteren will be on with a special On the Record as we continue to follow this disaster in the Shuttle Columbia. 7 astronauts dying apparently upon re-entry. And something that I don't know how you felt, Bridget, but I heard it this morning first on the radio, and it's something that just, it brought back all those feelings I had back in 1986. It was January 28th in 86. Krista McCullough and all the other astronauts, the other 6, going down on launch.
Yeah, I remember driving to work that day, and it seemed like such an ordinary day, and then hearing the reports on the radio initially of what had happened to Challenger, and I felt the same way this morning, I think.
The Columbia's lost. There are no survivors.
And tonight, the president leads the nation in prayers and in mourning in this terrible, terrible loss for our country. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kelly Ring.
I'm John Wilson. It has been a painful day for America as we watch catastrophic pictures of that space shuttle as it plunged to Earth in a trail of fire, killing all on board.
Fox 13 crews are everywhere tonight. First, we want to go to a man who has covered space for nearly 2 decades. Fox 13's Warren Ellie here in our studios tonight. Warren.
Well, Kelly, the echoes of Challenger all these years later. Once again, the grip of horror and grief across the world. And once again, the vow to return to flight, to fix what's happened, to not allow the Columbia 7 to have died in vain. With Columbia in orbit, maneuvering off the Arabian Peninsula, the traditional wake-up call to the astronauts on landing day, perhaps foretelling the tragedy ahead, bagpipe music played especially for astronaut Laurel Clark.
We're getting ready for a big day up here. Had a great time on orbit and really excited to come back home.
Little did the crew of 6 Americans and Israel's first astronaut know they'd never make it home. Of the 7, only 3 had flown in space before.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
The first hint of trouble, lost communications. This was the last heard from Columbia.
And Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages, and we did not copy your last.
Roger.
About that same time, just after 9 Eastern time, residents from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana reported hearing a big bang, and they saw flames in the sky.
We saw the spirals in the sky.
Spirals, okay.
There were spirals like a high-flying jet, except it wasn't in a straight line.
Pieces of Columbia fell over a wide area, and NASA appealed to the public to avoid contact with the wreckage or to inhale toxic gases from it. And as the countdown clock flag at Kennedy Space Center flew at half-mast, the first words from a shocked NASA.
At this time, we have no indication that the mishap was caused by anything or anyone on the ground.
Astronaut Bill Reedy was with the crew families waiting for their landing at Kennedy.
One thing came across loud and clear when visiting with them is they knew that the crew was absolutely dedicated to the mission that they were performing. They believed in what they were doing. And in the conversations with the crew and their families, they said that we must find what happened and fix it and move on. And we can't let their sacrifice be in vain.
Liftoff of Space Shuttle Columbia with a... Much of the early speculation focused on Columbia's launch. What NASA says is a piece of insulation from the orbiter's huge main tank, a piece of debris that hits the leading edge of Columbia's left wing, the same wing where abnormally high tire pressure was reported just before the apparent explosion and breakup of the orbiter.
But we have to caution you and ourselves that we can't rush to judgment on it, because there are a lot of things in this business that look like the smoking gun but turn out not even to be close.
Roger, roll, Columbia.
There's going to be a period of mourning in this community, but we're going to fix this problem. We're going to get back on the launch pad. We're going to launch shuttles again as soon as we're ready.
The question tonight, of course, how long till they're ready? It was 20 months after the Challenger disaster before Discovery could return to flight. After this disaster now, who knows, John, how soon? They were 16 minutes from landing.
Warren, thank you. The president was at Camp David today to talk about Iraq when the news came that the shuttle was lost. He returned to the White House immediately and began calling those family members of the astronauts to offer the nation's condolences. He then faced a camera in the White House and spoke to the nation.
My fellow Americans, this day has brought terrible news and great sadness to our country. At 9 o'clock this morning, Mission Control in Houston lost contact with our space shuttle Columbia. A short time later, debris was seen falling from the skies above Texas. The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors. On board was a crew of 7. Colonel Rick Husband, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, Commander Laurel Clark, Captain David Brown, Commander William McCool, Dr. Kulpna Shabla, and Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. These men and women assumed great risk in the service to all humanity. In an age when space flight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook the dangers of travel by rocket and the difficulties of navigating the fierce outer atmosphere of the Earth. These astronauts knew the dangers, and they faced them willingly, knowing they had a high and noble purpose in life. Because of their courage and daring and idealism, we will miss them all the more. All Americans today are thinking as well of the families of these men and women who have been given this sudden shock and grief. You're not alone. Our entire nation grieves with you. And those you loved will always have the respect and gratitude of this country. The cause in which they died will continue. Mankind is led into the darkness beyond our world by the inspiration of discovery and the longing to understand. Our journey into space will go on. In the skies today, we saw destruction and tragedy. Yet farther than we can see, there's comfort and hope. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, lift your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry hosts one by one and calls them each by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. The same Creator who names the stars also knows the names of the 7 souls we mourn today. The crew of the Shuttle Columbia did not return safely to Earth, yet we can pray that all are safely home. May God bless the grieving families, and may God continue to bless America.